The grand ballroom of the Washington Marriott hummed with anticipation. Staffers made final adjustments to the Department of Justice seal displayed prominently behind the podium, while technicians tested microphones and cameras focused on the empty stage. The room had filled quickly. Every major network and publication was present, with journalists whispering among themselves about what to expect from the administration's controversial new Attorney General. At precisely 2 p.m., Pam Bondi entered from stage right, flanked by two senior DOJ officials. Her navy suit and confident stride projected the image of a prosecutor rather than a politician. The flashing cameras intensified as she approached the podium, but her expression remained composed. "Good afternoon," she began, her Florida accent subtle but unmistakable. "Thank you for being here today. I'm honored to address you as the 86th Attorney General of the United States." For the next 12 minutes, Bondi outlined her vision with methodical precision. She emphasized three priorities: restoring public confidence in equal application of federal law, addressing the fentanyl crisis devastating communities nationwide, and strengthening support for law enforcement while holding bad actors accountable. The Department of Justice doesn't belong to any president, party, or special interest, she stated firmly. It belongs to the American people. Lady Justice wears a blindfold for a reason, and under my leadership, we will honor that principle. As she concluded her prepared remarks, the tension in the room shifted. Journalists straightened in their seats, prepared their questions. Bondi nodded to her press secretary, who began calling on reporters. 3 standard questions followed, about specific cases, her transition plans, her response to critics who questioned her qualifications. Bondi answered each with the practiced precision of someone who had spent decades in legal proceedings. Then came the 4th question. "Marcus Winters, the progressive voice," announced a tall man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses, rising from the 3rd row without waiting to be acknowledged. Something in his tone caused the other journalists to turn. Winters had built his reputation on confrontational questions, but the gleam in his eye suggested something beyond professional skepticism. "Ms. Bondi," he began, emphasizing the M's. With subtle condescension, "How does it feel to be the newest puppet in Trump's Justice Department theater? Another Florida yes-woman ready to dismantle the rule of law at his command?" The press secretary stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Bondi raised her hand slightly, stopping him. The room fell completely silent. Reporters who had been typing froze, their fingers hovering above keyboards. Camera operators zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression that crossed the Attorney General's face. For 3 full seconds, Bondi said nothing. She simply looked directly at Winters, her gaze neither angry nor intimidated, just evaluating. The silence stretched uncomfortably until she finally spoke. The room held its collective breath. Several journalists shifted uncomfortably, some embarrassed by their colleagues' naked hostility, others eagerly anticipating fireworks. A staffer moved to cut Winters' microphone, but Bondi gestured for them to stop. "Actually," she said, her voice measured and clear, "I'd like the sound technician to turn up Mr. Winters' microphone, please, and mine as well." She stepped out from behind the podium, removing her prepared notes and placing them face down. The move was unexpected, an abandonment of both physical barrier and script. Secret Service agents at the back of the room straightened slightly, their training triggered by the deviation from protocol. "Mr. Winters, I know you," Bondi began, making deliberate eye contact with the journalist who had momentarily lost his confrontational expression to surprise. "I've read your work for 20 years. She walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the press corps. Your three-part series on prison conditions in 2009 was extraordinary journalism. Your coverage of the opioid crisis in Appalachia gave voice to families who had been ignored. Even your piece criticizing my handling of the mortgage settlement as Florida's Attorney General, while I disagreed with your conclusions, showed careful research and genuine concern for consumers. Winters blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting this response. Around him, other journalists had stopped typing, their stories about partisan combat suddenly derailed. That man, the one who sought truth above headlines, wrote with integrity, Bondi continued. Her voice carried no anger, just a wistfulness that was somehow more powerful than any outrage would have been. He didn't need to use loaded language or personal attacks to make his point. She paused, allowing the contrast to sink in. A camera flashed, capturing Winters's increasingly uncomfortable expression. The Justice Department isn't a theater, and I'm no one's puppet. I've spent my career standing up to powerful interests when they've broken the law, regardless of party. She spoke directly to Winters, but loud enough for everyone to hear. In Florida, I took on fraudulent charities, human traffickers, and pharmaceutical companies flooding our streets with pills. I've prosecuted Republicans and Democrats alike when evidence warranted it. She took a breath and softened her tone further. Marcus? May I call you Marcus? We've never met personally, but I respected your work enough to remember your name through the years. I wonder if you might consider something. The kind of question you just asked doesn't seek information. It doesn't illuminate truth. It's designed solely to provoke and divide. Bondi glanced around the room, taking in the bank of cameras and the reporters who had turned their attention from their notepads to her face. I understand we have different views on policy. That's healthy in a democracy. If you'd like to interview me about my actual positions, not caricatures, my door is open. We could have a substantive conversation about the proper role of federal law enforcement, about the balance between justice and mercy, about how to rebuild trust in institutions. That would serve your readers far better than this public performance. She returned to the podium, but remained standing beside it rather than behind it. Now, does anyone have questions about the work of the Department of Justice? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the uncomfortable recognition of a moment that had gone off script in ways no one had anticipated. Cameras captured Winters slowly taking his seat, his face flushed. The next question, when it finally came, was notably substantive, about specific plans for addressing the fentanyl crisis, and Bondi answered with the detailed knowledge of someone who had done her homework. The press conference continued for another 20 minutes, but something fundamental had shifted in the room. Even journalists with reputations for aggressive questioning framed their inquiries with newfound professionalism. And though few would admit it immediately, many found themselves respecting a political opponent in ways that had become rare in Washington. By 9 p.m. that evening, the exchange between Bondi and Winters had been viewed over 2 million times across multiple platforms. Cable news channels ran the clip on loop, their panels of experts dissecting every word and gesture like sports analysts after a championship game. Marcus Winters sat alone in his apartment, bourbon in hand, watching himself on his own television. The network had called 3 times already. His editor wanted him on air to provide context for what had happened. He'd declined. What context could he possibly offer? That he'd gone in determined to create a viral moment and had succeeded, just not in the way he'd intended. His phone buzzed again, a text from a colleague at a rival publication. Bold move today. Surprised she didn't eviscerate you. That was the thing that kept replaying in his mind. She could have, should have, perhaps. Instead, she'd done something far more devastating. She'd been kind in a way that made him question himself. Across town, in a secure government vehicle, Pam Bondi scrolled through message after message on her official phone. Her press secretary sat beside her, reading aloud reactions from various outlets. The Post is calling it a masterclass in diffusing hostility. Fox News says you're defined grace under pressure. Even the Progressive Voice, Winter's own outlet, has an editorial up saying while they stand by their concerns about your policies, they regret the personalized nature of the exchange. Bondi looked up from her phone. That's enough for tonight, David. We have real work to focus on tomorrow. But this is a win, Madam Attorney General. We should capitalize on it. She shook her head firmly. We're not going to turn this into some kind of victory lap. That would undermine everything I was trying to say about elevating the discourse. Her press secretary looked disappointed but nodded. Yes, ma'am. The next morning brought a new wave of commentary. What had initially split along predictable partisan lines was evolving into something more nuanced. A respected media critic published a piece titled, "When Journalists Become the Story, the Winters-Bondi Moment." Several veteran reporters from across the political spectrum wrote reflections on the changing nature of political journalism and the responsibility of the press in divisive times. At the Progressive Voice headquarters, the editorial board was in emergency session. Winters sat at the table, tie loosened, as his colleagues debated the publication's response. "We can't throw Marcus under the bus," argued the executive editor, "but we need to acknowledge that the framing of the question was problematic." "The question reflected concerns our readers have," countered another editor. "Concerns can be raised without using terms like puppet," said a third. Winters cleared his throat. "I crossed a line," he admitted quietly. "Not in questioning her independence, that's our job, but in how I did it." The room fell silent. Winters had built his reputation on never backing down. When he returned to his desk after the meeting, a courier package was waiting. Inside was a bound collection of his early investigative pieces, the same ones Bondi had referenced. A handwritten note was attached. "This is the journalist America needs. I meant what I said about that interview whenever you're ready. PB." Winters sat staring at the note for a long time, remembering why he'd become a journalist in the first place. Meanwhile, Bondi continued her scheduled appearances, systematically refusing to mention the incident, as her staff had taken to calling it. At a community forum on criminal justice reform in Baltimore, a local reporter tried to bring it up. "Madam Attorney General, your response to Marcus Winters has gone viral. I'd prefer to focus on why we're here today," Bondi interjected politely but firmly. "The families in this community have real concerns about safety and justice that deserve our full attention." The crowd, many of whom had expected to dislike the new Attorney General, responded with unexpected applause. A woman in the front row, who had lost her son to gun violence, nodded appreciatively. By the end of the week, something remarkable had happened. The viral moment had sparked genuine conversation about civil discourse in America. Opinion pieces and social media discussions reflected on how routine personal attacks had become in political spaces. Some dismissed it as a momentary blip in the relentless cycle of partisanship, but others, in living rooms and classrooms and community centers, were asking if there might be another way. In the Justice Department, Bondi gathered her senior staff for a Friday meeting. "I've received over 200 media requests this week," she told them, "most having nothing to do with Justice Department priorities. I'm declining them all. Our work isn't about personalities or viral moments. It's about upholding the law and serving the American people. A young staffer raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, don't you think you could use this positive coverage to build support for your agenda? Bondi looked at her thoughtfully. The moment people believe I orchestrated that exchange for political gain is the moment its value is lost. Some things need to stand on their own without being weaponized. Even in politics, perhaps especially in politics, there has to be room for genuine human moments. As the meeting concluded, her phone lit up with a notification. It was an email from Marcus Winters requesting an interview, not about the viral exchange, but about her priorities for the Justice Department. 3 weeks after the conference, Marcus Winters arrived at the Department of Justice. The imposing building, with its neoclassical columns and Art Deco interiors, seemed to embody the weight of American jurisprudence itself. He was escorted through security protocols with surprising efficiency, then led to a modest conference room rather than the Attorney General's formal office. Bondi entered without ceremony, dressed in a simple burgundy suit, carrying her own coffee and a folder of documents. She greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Winters." "Marcus, please," he responded, noticing how different she seemed in person compared to her public persona. What began as a carefully choreographed interview, both parties watchful and guarded, gradually transformed as the conversation progressed. The turning point came when Winters set his recorder aside. "Off the record, Madam Attorney General, I owe you an apology." She studied him for a moment. "I appreciate that, but I'd rather focus on substance than apologies." This small exchange shifted something fundamental between them. The conversation that followed wasn't about scoring points or generating headlines, but about genuinely understanding opposing perspectives. Winters raised concerns about the independence of the DOJ, speaking candidly about his fears based on past administrations. Bondi didn't dismiss these concerns, but outlined specific safeguards she had implemented, including a transparent recusal policy and strengthened Inspector General oversight. They discovered unexpected common ground on criminal justice reform. Both believed minimum mandatory sentences had gone too far. Both worried about the militarization of police forces. They disagreed fundamentally on regulatory approaches, but found they shared concerns about government transparency. When their scheduled hour ended, they continued talking for another 40 minutes. "Would you consider publishing the full transcript?" Bondi asked as they concluded. "Not sound bites or selected quotes, the entire conversation, disagreements and all." Winters hesitated only briefly before nodding. "That's not how we usually do things. But maybe that's the point." The resulting article, published the following Sunday, bore the simple headline, "A Conversation on Justice." It presented their exchange in full, respectful but frank, without either compromising their core principles. The piece concluded with a joint statement they had crafted together. "We remain divided on many policy questions, but united in believing that democracy depends on our ability to disagree without demonizing one another. This conversation represents not a compromise of principles, but a commitment to seeing the human behind the politics." The reaction was mixed. Some called it naive, others refreshing. But in a political landscape dominated by shouting and spectacle, their example, her grace under pressure, and his willingness to reconsider, offered a glimpse of another possibility: that political opponents need not be enemies, and that bridges, however small, could still be built across America's widening divides.